President-elect Donald Trump met with journalists and editors at the New York Times Tuesday for a wide-ranging conversation that covered the election, Hillary Clinton, climate change and foreign policy. One question focused on the growing movement in the United States that calls itself the alt-right. Critics say the group has been energized by Trump's win. When asked about the movement, Trump answered, quote, "I don't want to energize the group. I'm not looking to energize them. I don't want to energize the group, and I disavow the group. What we want to do is we want to bring the country together because the country is very, very divided, and I'm going to work very hard to bring the country together." Concerns about the so-called alt-right were heightened after a conference that took place over the weekend in Washington, D.C., where hundreds gathered to celebrate Donald Trump's victory, and some attendees raised their arms in the traditional Nazi salute as leader Richard Spencer spoke.
America was, until this past generation, a white country designed for ourselves and our posterity. It is our creation. It is our inheritance, and it belongs to us.
Leaders of the self-proclaimed alt-right movement were also emboldened after Trump named Steve Bannon to become his chief strategist after first being his campaign manager. Bannon is the former head of the right-wing news outlet Breitbart Media. Well, for more, we're joined by Catherine Franke, director of the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law at Columbia University. Her recent piece for the Los Angeles Review of Books is headlined, "Making White Supremacy Respectable Again." Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Catherine Franke. Could you tell us about this piece, Making White Supremacy Respectable Again? You wrote it in response to a New York Times opinion piece by your Columbia University colleague, Mark Lilla. Tell us what you found objectionable in the arguments he articulated in his piece, which was headlined, "The End of Identity Liberalism."
Well, thank you for having me on the show and for engaging this piece. You know, the arguments that Lila makes in the New York Times op-ed are not new. They resonate with arguments that were made in the late 1990s by the likes of Todd Gitlin or Michael Tomasky, who really felt like enough already of being bothered by special interests, whether that was women, people of color, gay and lesbian people. Let's get back to what made America great, which was liberal democracy that our founding fathers had in mind, and that this attention to racism, sexism, homophobia is really a distraction and a kind of surrender to self-indulgence that is counterproductive. For my colleague, Professor Lila, to issue this kind of op-ed in the New York Times at this time just struck me as enormously insensitive, both to the political situation we're in now, where Donald Trump's election signals the invitation of a kind of new white supremacy in this country, but even more than that, or parallel to that, what's going on at Columbia. I feel I'm worried about his students as he issues this op-ed in the same week that a number of young men on our wrestling team at Columbia were chastised and then discharged from the team for issuing the most ugly, sexist, racist, and homophobic tweets among themselves. So there's ugly hatred going on our campus. There's ugly hatred going on in this country, and Lila is collaborating and facilitating and rendering that hatred respectable again.
Well, I'd like to ask you about a specific point that he makes in the article, which is that during her campaign, Hillary Clinton explicitly referred to African-American, Latino, LGBT, and women voters, but in so doing, he writes, a large percentage of the American electorate were excluded, and according to Lila, this accounts in part for her defeat, since white working-class and evangelical voters voted almost across the board for Trump. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do, and you know, as my wise friend Suzanne Hoover said to me yesterday after she read the piece in the LA Review of Books, in a way what we're seeing here is a kind of seductive argument to well-intentioned liberals who are tired of feeling uncomfortable. They have a kind of identity fatigue. They're tired of being called out for their privilege. Let's get back to the kinds of forms of governance we're comfortable with. And those are the forms of governance that are white-led, and where the interests of white people figure at the center as the neutral norm.
Well, let's turn to President-elect Trump. Your response to the fact that yesterday to the New York Times he said that he disavows the alt-right movement and that Steve Bannon is not a part of it. Why do you think, first of all, why did he say that? Because that's not exactly what he said in the past. And do you think it indicates a shift away from Trump's association with white supremacy?
I guess we'll see. You know, on Monday he says one thing, on Tuesday he says another, on Wednesday we'll hear another thing. I don't have any faith from watching this man on a national political stage that any of this he feels deeply in his heart and will remain consistent in repudiating white supremacists like Richard Spencer or like Steve Bannon or like Breitbart News. Indeed, he's baking them into his administration with the kind of appointments that he's making of right-wing supporters of white supremacy, and or appointing people with absolutely no experience or expertise to things like the UN representative, or excuse me, the U.S. representative to the UN, or Ben Carson at HUD, who knows absolutely nothing about housing. I mean, I guess I could do brain surgery, but very badly,
right.
Just as Dr. Carson could run HUD, but surely quite badly.
Well, what about Mike Pence, the second in command, the vice president-elect? There's speculation that, in fact, he may be the most powerful vice president in history in the United States.
Well, he actually knows a little something about how government works, both on the state level and on the federal level, which it's a low bar, but he certainly passes it. But if we can understand Donald Trump as a kind of robber baron who uses crony capitalism to undermine democracy, what we see in Mike Pence is the ascent or the victory of evangelical Christianity as a way to overcome underlying long-term commitment to democracy and pluralism, value pluralism in this country. So what I think what we certainly saw with Governor Pence in Indiana, and I think what we'll see with Vice President Pence in Washington, is the turn to religious liberty as a kind of delivery system for white Christian nationalism.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Catherine Franke, for joining us. Catherine Franke is director of the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law at Columbia University.